The final panelist for this evening is Cindy Milstein, who is a part of Occupy Philadelphia. Cindy is at the Institute for Anarchist Study board member and an active participant in Occupy Philly. She's been involved in numerous anti-capitalist efforts, collective spaces, and popular education projects, such as co-organizing the upcoming Occupy from Below, Resist, Reflect, Recreate tract at the Left Forum in New York. She is the author of Anarchism and Its Aspirations and the forthcoming collective book, Paths Toward Utopia, Explorations in Everyday Anarchism. And I am delighted that you are on this panel, and you want to just...
I'm going to stand up.
And she's going to stand up.
I'm an anti-capitalist, and one thing I hate about capitalism is it destroys the whole world, including memory and historical memory and memory of movements by, like, writing off anything that the power of people. And so I've been really appreciating stories are really, really powerful ways for us to take back our world again. Okay. So I actually wanted to talk about, focus on diversity of tactics as a strategy toward a goal that allows for a whole bunch of tactics. And look at that concept through the lens of two large mobilizations which looked sort of like the Occupy movement in a lot of its parameters, and really is sort of the precursors and why we see Occupy being, I think, part of the same lineage of mass mobilizations that involved direct democracy, a lot of self-organization, from street medics to food, to carnivals, to all sorts of things that people self-organize themselves in moments when people took the twofold meaning of direct action, which I understand to be, one is stopping things we don't like ourselves, like putting ourselves, there were some great examples of that, but the other part of direct action that I actually love more and think is more powerful is when we just decide to do things the way we want to see them done without looking to other people to do them. We directly do the world ourselves in the way we want, which to me is the revolutionary, the beginning of the process of what revolution looks like. So that's why I want to focus on diversity of tactics, because I feel like it is part of this move toward us reclaiming space to make the world we want. And I actually want to step back a little. A lot of this conversation has been about strategy, and to me that actually, the kind of missing thing in there is strategy for what? So I always like, for me it's more important to think about what's our goal, our aspirations, our ideals, what do we want to see? And that might look really different for all of us, but I want to talk about two moments where there were people who framed it around a specific goal, and then had a strategy to get there, and used different tactics. And I feel like part of the Occupy movement, I would hope we would move toward more sort of, what is our goals in very transparent ways. So the first moment is where the phrase diversity of tactics came from. It was, I'm pretty sure it was probably some, I'm pretty sure I know exactly the person who wrote it, but it was a small group of anarchists in Montreal who at the height of what's known as the, people call it the anti-globalization movement or the alter-globalization or the counter-globalization movement. But the movement in North America that we understand sort of starting with Seattle in 1999, which Dave Solnit, I think, was speaking to two times ago. And Canadian anti-authoritarians and anarchists, I think, are like 20 million times smarter than we are here in the United States. And so they saw some of the problems about some of the mass mobilizations happening is that people needed more of a basis of unity. So they came up with exactly that, hammered it out in directly democratic ways. And the group in Montreal called themselves CLAC, which is French, but it stood for Anti-Capitalist Convergence. And the basis of unity was something they came through directly democratic processes like we do in General Assembly over a long time period. And I won't go through all the details, but some of it was an opposition to capitalism, neoliberalism, anti-imperialism, and a host of other isms that we don't, racism, patriarchy. But the interesting part of this basis of unity, I think, also, was that it called for autonomous, decentralized, and non-hierarchical forms of organization, a confrontational attitude that rejects reformist alternatives to the structures we're opposing. So the sort of linchpin of this basis of unity was the diversity of tactics phrase, which was, quote, the use of a variety of creative initiatives ranging from public education campaigns to direct action. And they understood this as doing a bunch of things. Number one, it was a goal in itself. Our goal is to create a society that is autonomous, decentralized, non-hierarchical, without exploitation, forms of domination, and the other things that they had listed that they didn't like. But to do that, that meant creating coexistence of people who don't all agree with each other. What does unity of diversity look like? How does it look like I always like the idea of an orchestra where you have all sorts of different instruments, but there's something that comes together that sounds beautiful, but we wouldn't tell all the instruments to play the same way or it wouldn't work. So there's same way as actually the goal is a society that allows for a diversity of human beings living a diversity of ways as long as they're not exploiting, hurting, endangering each other, and everybody has enough of what they want and desire. So it itself was a goal, and it became a strategy to how to do these mass mobilizations. So the way they understood why it was important was not as anything goes, anyone can do whatever they want, but precisely the opposite. That it opened up space for everybody to understand themselves in that diversity. It allowed for a specific framework that everyone had come to and agreed to. So now we can actually have conversations about what different strategies would work to get at what we want together that would actually work in harmony with each other, be in solidarity, help us have each other's backs in better ways, and keep everybody safer in the different ways we understood that, while also being able to do different sort of confrontational activities. Okay, so I just wanted to touch on then two specific moments in this. One was in 2001 in Quebec City, which is where really one of the most interesting I was at. It was incredible. I thought revolution was first time in my life. I thought, oh, in North America we might actually see revolution. And maybe it will take a little longer, which I appreciate. It takes a long time. But they used this throughout the form of this mobilization, which was to contest the Summit of the Americas, which was meeting there. There's a castle, basically, structure in the middle of Quebec City. And so they framed this convergence against capitalism as attacking the fortress, which had become this castle, which was literally ringed with fences of police to protect the world leaders who were deciding the fate of billions and billions of people. And what was beautiful about the diversity of tactics, I'll just use one example, was they spent a long time hammering out very explicitly that there would be red, yellow, and green zones. Now, the police didn't necessarily respect those zones, but the idea was we would have an agreement that people could then pick the level of which they felt. So in the yellow zone, green zone, which was safer zone, there was this big space under an overpass, which there was food that we all made together and a lot of bands, and you could hang out, and it was a space where nothing, people were not going to try to draw the police into. There was childcare, et cetera, et cetera. It was a space where you could come to, chill out and relax and, in theory, get away from police during the mass mobilization. The red zone was going to directly go up and confront the fence that was standing in front of the fortress. And then within that red zone, which we spent, I think, a 5-mile walk to get there one day, thousands and thousands of people walking to get up there, was they had constructed this giant catapult because the fort did look very medieval. And so the catapult, if you stood behind the catapult, you definitely wanted to be confrontational, but a little less confrontational. And if you stood in front of the catapult, you really wanted to be confrontational, meaning the goal was to tear that fence down, which that day symbolically was to open the fort, to tear down the fortress, to make the space ours, just symbolically, right? And what was beautiful about the catapult was it was flinging, it got toward the fence, and it started flinging teddy bears over it. Okay. It was anarchists who were at the catapult, who had made the catapult, and one of them was very, very articulate, and he kept getting in the media all the time and actually ended up getting, wouldn't be let into the United States, later seen as a terrorist because he was throwing teddy bears over the fence at police. The police, in turn, catapulted tear gas canisters back across at us. So the people in front of the catapult had big buckets, and they caught the tear gas canisters, had really thick gloves, and threw them back at the police, who were extremely well protected from tear gas, unlike the many thousands of us who weren't. So it was a very, the medics were running around, all of us got tear gassed, even if you felt like you were behind the catapult, But then there were people who'd stayed in the green zone, which was quite a distance away and didn't have to experience tear gas. And then we all reconvened after hours and hours of trying to rip the fence down and battling tear gas and running through the streets and everybody feeling really good because we'd created this space that felt safe in the way everybody wanted to, but really confrontational. We had a big, wonderful celebration together later at the end of the day. So it's just an interesting moment where people together can figure out a strategy that makes sense at a specific moment. Obviously, capitalism's still here, didn't work. All right, so the other thing I want to just talk about for about 5 minutes or so, and then I'll wrap up, is something I'm using Canadian examples because they're the ones that brought diversity of tactics into into our language of mobilizations. And in 2010, I went to this mobilization too. It was in Vancouver, and it was called No Olympics on Stolen Native Land. They spent also about a year and a half through directly democratic assemblies, agreements. They had thousands of people organizing this. At one point, they were also mad at each other. They had 3 people in the room, and then they said, nope, we're going to keep doing this. I actually didn't understand why you would want to oppose the Olympics so much until I went to Vancouver, and then I understood that what happened was, for the 2 years leading up to that, they were trying to build all these luxury condos literally on stolen native lands, and so there'd been massive amounts of indigenous folks standing in front of bulldozers, doing a lot of direct action to stop those kinds of building projects. They'd taken queer youth centers and given them to the transgendered or queer athletes, and displaced really poor kids in Quebec City who were queer, who didn't have a place to go. That's just the tip, again and again, in all sorts of ways, it affected everybody. So what was really beautiful about this moment was the diversity of tactics strategy, which again they agreed to as a framework, brought people that were indigenous. There's a lot of East Indians in Vancouver, poor and homeless, many of whom are women and many of whom are indigenous women in Vancouver. Non-documented, there's a huge non-documented groups of people and immigrants, all doing really good work under something called No One is Illegal. Anarchists and a whole bunch of other people to these directly democratic assemblies to figure out what it would look like to do something under this goal called No Olympics on Stolen Native Lands. And what was beautiful about that phrase was it also got at the idea that capitalism has stolen the entire world from us in every way. So, everything, when I got to Vancouver, everything had been really stolen by the capitalistic display of Olympics. And people were really great. They're like, we love sports. This isn't against sports. It's against the commodification of sports. I was even one night with a bunch of local people who really wanted to go to the games, and they're like, none of us can go because the tickets are $500 each. So even if you wanted to participate in the Olympics, it wasn't something for the community. So the 2 things that I think were really, this was one of the most moving week-long or so demonstrations I've ever been at. Every day they had 2 or 3 things going on. But what they did over a year was hammer out what would happen on those 7 days of the Olympics, where each group that had come to the table would get to create the theme and the focus of each day, and other people, because of a diversity of tactics, would agree to be in solidarity and back up what was happening. So I just wanted to point to 2 of these days, which were really, really remarkable, because you could tell the work that went into this to allow people to be on the streets, to have each other's backs in the way, to let people do things they wanted to do in different ways that were really powerful. One was the first day that the Olympics was set to open. There was going to be this grand multi-billion-dollar ceremony in the center of Vancouver that was revolving around glorifying indigenous people. A few of the indigenous nations had signed on to this. Most of the indigenous nations were really upset about this, but it was like, oh, look, all the indigenous people are really excited about the Olympics, when actually it probably impacted indigenous people more than anyone in Vancouver. So the indigenous folks wanted to lead a long march that night called Take Back Our City. And they asked the No One is Illegal people, who are, again, there was thousands of us there. There was thousands of indigenous people in the center walking. On one side, there was a huge contingent of No One is Illegal, most of whom are East Indian. And on the other side were thousands of anarchists, some of whom were, dressed up in all black, others of whom were just dressed up like people. But it was really clear they were anarchists from their banners. It was really clear the indigenous people, and it was really clear who the No One is Illegal were. And thousands of us walked this march to where this thing was happening, and we come literally this close to a line of police. The indigenous folks are this close to a line of police. And it was called family friendly, so we stood there, and it was getting more and more tense because the police were not happy we were there. And the indigenous people were getting more and more upset because they knew inside there was this really horrible spectacle using them to make the Olympics seem wonderful. And they stood up and they gave speech after speech after speech saying we wouldn't be able to be here right now and be okay standing nose to nose with the police if it wasn't for the anarchists who'd made this safe feel comfortable for us, if it wasn't for the No One is Illegal people who made it feel comfortable for us. On each side of us, they're holding us to be able to walk to this space. And we created this as a family-friendly space. We asked nobody to be confrontational. We asked that we would stop here. And we did that for about an hour. And then they said, and we want to just thank especially the anarchists for being willing to go along with this after us figuring out this. So we are now going to walk backwards for a block, which we hadn't planned to do. And when we're gone, we're going to say, now, and you guys can do whatever you want. And that wasn't actually planned. And it was this beautiful moment where everybody was so stunned that I was actually doing media, but I was on the side of the anarchist bloc, and it was really nice because the anarchist bloc actually encircled the indigenous folks, many of whom were quite elderly, and made sure they could get away safely because there was lots of police and it was scary. And then the anarchists went back and stood nose to nose with the police and basically took their hats off and put them on their heads, which is about pretty much what happened. You know, someone threw a plastic bin over, the police threw it back, they had riot gear on, and that was the end of it. But what was interesting about it was just this moment of a sense of people being in it, trusting each other, being able to do something together, and allowing for something spontaneous. The second part of this, and then I'll end, was 2 or 3 days later, there was what was meant to be anarchists using the strategy of black bloc masking up so people can't tell who you look like, which is the only purpose of it. If it's a tactic to evade police strategy, it's not an identity, it's not an organization. And they had to call this day the heart attack, that capitalism is destroying us, it's giving us a heart attack. And they had planned to walk about 3 miles to blockade where the Olympics were supposed to go up to the mountains to start that day. And they went, you know, I was again doing media, so I was walking down the street, and what was amazing was there were all these folks who were liberal NGOs who had been part of the organizing who decided to mask up and walk in the block. So it actually wasn't, because they had gained such trust, they're like, we're mad about this, we actually want to be a little more confrontational today and go actually blockade a street at the end of this. So we're walking down miles after miles, huge, even bigger police presence, of course, because it's anarchists, they always send more police. And so walking, we get to the downtown, there's about a mile-long strip of nothing but large, very fancy glass buildings. Glass, okay. And we're walking down the street, and the police kept trying to taunt us. They kept coming over and hitting with sticks and kind of, you know, I mean, I was not, again, I was doing media at this, so, but they were attacking my friend who was a journalist. They actually broke his camera. So they kept coming over and trying to attack us to provoke it. And everyone's like, no, we're disciplined. We have a mission. We're going 3 miles. We're going to shut down the Olympics. And all of a sudden, we looked around and we saw a lot of the indigenous folks that had been marching the other day, and they were on the corners of all the streets telling us where the police were and trying to keep the police away from us and directing us so we could keep walking. And it was so moving. None of us had expected them to show up. But they kept going, we're here for you now because you were here for us the other day. And we walk down, and then we get in front of the Hudson Bay Company, and 1 or 2 people break the Hudson Bay window. And everybody who was there, indigenous folks, the liberal NGOs, and everyone was like, great, that's wonderful, let's keep going. Because the Hudson Bay Company had been the prime sponsor of the Olympics. The Hudson Bay Company had been the prime corporation decades ago, centuries ago, who'd come to Vancouver, that part of the territory which was indigenous land, and stolen native lands. So it was this so symbolic to people that everybody was like, that was so perfect, that was so right, now let's just keep going, we're walking down the street. And we all ended up the street, and of course there were so many police we couldn't blockade, and they ended up arresting tons of us at the end. But again, I just wanted to point to, regardless of what you think is the correct tactic to use of confrontation, you know, at certain moments, this idea that we can create space so people can do things that are symbolically important and pushing the edge of things and have each other's back. And what was most powerful at the Olympics for me was the first day when I got there, there was this scrappy anarchist convergence space with all these like great, you know, bands and stuff and free food and blah, blah, blah. And there were a lot of indigenous folks there, and one of them stood up and he goes, we've already won. We've already won because we had 3 goals when we started doing this. One was to put the Olympic organizers on the defensive. They're completely on the defensive because we've illuminated everything they're doing that's horrible, and people get that in our city, which again was true, and that was the second goal, was to illuminate all the ways they had stolen everything from everyone in Vancouver, and they really had done an incredible job in that. Every person on the street was in support of what was going on, even if they wanted to go to the Olympics, or not everyone, but a huge percentage of the city was behind this. And the last goal was we wanted to build relationships between people who don't usually have relationships in the city. Indigenous folks, anarchists, some of whom were East Indian, some of whom were indigenous, and homeless people, etc. We wanted to build solid relationships and be able to trust and be able to move forward as communities. And that was so clear. So toward the end of the week, I went to this dinner that had like 600 people that was put on it by indigenous folks, and I ended up being one of the few white people there at the end, and probably the only anarchist because a lot of people had left. And they all stood up and they said, we just have to thank the anarchists and the East Indians and the no one's legal and the homeless people and everybody for seeing that we're all in the same fight together. And it was so moving to me because I felt like I was overhearing something that wasn't meant for me. But that, to me, was the beauty of why so my end of this is I hope we can think about whether we put it in paper or not, is trying to have a little bit more compassion and trust and building toward real relationships that allow us to see that the diversity of who we are and what we do and how we do that actually is going to make us a stronger movement and actually make us effective in getting rid of hierarchy, domination, exploitation, injustice.
Thank you.